A man is pulled out of a burning warehouse. The mask goes on and oxygen runs at high flow, but his lactate is still severely elevated. That combination opens the whole lesson. Giving oxygen and using oxygen are not the same event. Fire victim questions often turn on one split. The defect may be getting oxygen to tissue or using it after it arrives. Carbon monoxide interferes with delivery, with the blood's ability to carry and release oxygen. Cyanide attacks utilization. Oxygen may reach a tissue while its mitochondria still cannot finish the job. So when a question hands you an enclosed space fire, a collapsing patient, severe lactate, and a cyanide antidote, ask whether the tested defect is oxygen delivery or oxygen utilization. Today, we build the utilization side from the ground up, the place inside the cell where oxygen is used, the molecular event that blocks it, and the event an antidote performs first. Let's start with the cast, because the classic way to get lost here is to hear 5 names in a row and never learn which one is the machine, which one is the fuel, and which one is the intruder. First character, oxygen. Chemically, it is a small molecule, 2 oxygen atoms, uncharged, small enough to diffuse across membranes without a transporter. That is what it is. Now, what does it do in this story? In the mitochondrion, oxygen is the final electron acceptor. It stands at the very end of a line, and its job is to take electrons off the end of that line and, together with hydrogen ions, become water. Hold that role in your head, because almost everything today is a consequence of it. Second character, and the central one, cytochrome C oxidase. Say it with me in pieces, cytochrome C oxidase. Its other name is complex 4. And after this scene, I will use both names, so let me tie them together now. Cytochrome C oxidase and complex 4 are the same object. What kind of thing is it? It is not a single small protein floating in fluid. It is a protein complex, several subunits assembled into one working unit, and it is a membrane protein embedded in the inner mitochondrial membrane, not the outer membrane, not the cytosol. The inner membrane, the folded one, the one that separates the mitochondrial matrix from the intermembrane space. Hold on to that location. Complex 4 spans the inner membrane, so it can couple 2 events at that wall: electron transfer to oxygen and proton movement from the matrix toward the intermembrane space. That coupling helps build the gradient used for ATP production. Complex 4 contains a chain of redox centers that carries electrons inward. At the terminal heme, a 3 copper B binuclear center, an iron atom held in heme, sits beside a copper ion. Oxygen is reduced to water at this terminal center. Cyanide toxicity makes sense only after you locate that metal-containing reaction site. A toxin does not poison an abstraction. It binds a physical site. Here, the relevant site is the metal-containing terminal center of complex 4 in the inner mitochondrial membrane. Third character, cyanide. Say it, cyanide. Cyanide is not a protein or an enzyme. It is a very small, negatively charged ion, 1 carbon, 1 nitrogen, and its role here is inhibitor. Its key relationship is with a metal-containing site in complex 4. We will make that binding event precise in scene 4. A language note: the word is cyanide, not hydride. Different word, different chemistry, different question. In Chinese, cyanide poisoning is Qinghua Wu Zhongdu, not Qinghua Wu Zhongdu. Now the normal transaction. Before anything breaks. Who pays whom, and what gets produced? When you burn glucose and fat, the useful product for this scene is not ATP directly. It is electrons. Glycolysis and the tricarboxylic acid cycle strip high-energy electrons off fuel molecules and load them onto two carriers, NADH and FADH2. Think of NADH and FADH2 as loaded delivery trucks. They are not the energy, they are carrying the energy, and they need somewhere to unload. Where they unload is the electron transport chain, a series of protein complexes sitting in the inner mitochondrial membrane. Electrons enter at the front of the line and pass from one complex to the next. Each handoff releases a bit of energy, and three of those complexes, complex I, complex 3, and complex 4, use that released energy to pump hydrogen ions out of the mitochondrial matrix into the intermembrane space. Now you have hydrogen ions piled up on one side of a membrane and depleted on the other. That difference is stored energy, a proton gradient, an electrochemical battery built across a wall. Nothing has been synthesized yet. All that exists is a charged battery. The battery is discharged by a different machine, a TP synthase. It is also embedded in the inner mitochondrial membrane, and it contains a channel that lets hydrogen ions flow back down into the matrix. That flow drives it to join ADP and inorganic phosphate into ATP. So the chain does not make ATP directly. The chain makes a gradient. The gradient makes ATP. Those are two separate steps, and separating them is what lets you answer uncoupler questions later. Electrons cannot pile up at the end of the line. If the last complex has nowhere to put them, it cannot accept new ones from upstream, and the complex before it cannot pass any along either. The whole line jams backward. Electron transport is a bucket brigade that still needs someone to take the last bucket. Oxygen is that someone. Complex 4 takes electrons from cytochrome C, a small mobile carrier protein that shuttles electrons to the complex and delivers them to oxygen at the heme A3 and copper center. Oxygen combines with those electrons and with hydrogen ions to form water. Let me stand the reaction up, with each slot named in plain words, because arrows alone do not teach. The enzyme is cytochrome C oxidase, complex 4. Its electron source is reduced cytochrome C. Its final electron acceptor is oxygen. Its product is water. Enzyme. Complex 4. Acceptor. Oxygen. Product. Water. Say that trio once out loud and it stops being a diagram. The chain physically requires a terminal electron acceptor. Oxygen fills that role, so blocking the final handoff stops electron flow upstream, which is precisely the door a poison is going to walk through. Now for cyanide, with all three role questions answered. What kind of thing is it? A small iron carbon bonded to nitrogen, carrying a negative charge. What role does it play here? Inhibitor of the electron transport chain. And who is it related to? This is the relationship that matters. Cyanide binds the iron in the heme, a 3-center of cytochrome C oxidase, specifically iron in its ferric state, iron 3+, the more oxidized form. 2 forms of iron will show up repeatedly today, so let me separate them now rather than after they cause trouble. Ferrous iron is iron 2+, ferric iron is iron 3+. One more positive charge, more oxidized. Ferrous 2+, ferric 3+. Whenever an option today mentions moving iron between those two states, it is describing a different drug than the one in our case, and you will see why in scene 9. Cyanide binds that ferric iron at the reaction center tightly, and once it is sitting there, the site is occupied. Oxygen cannot be reduced at a center that is already coordinated to something else. Walk the consequence forward one link at a time. Complex 4 cannot hand electrons to oxygen. Because it cannot unload, it cannot accept new electrons from cytochrome C. The brigade backs up along the whole chain. Proton pumping falls because the pumping was driven by those handoffs. The proton gradient across the inner membrane collapses. A TP synthase has no battery to discharge. Oxidative phosphorylation fails. And mitochondrial ATP production falls. The blood did not have to run out of oxygen for that chain to fail. Arterial oxygen can be normal, and oxygen molecules can reach tissue while the final mitochondrial handoff remains blocked. The toxin breaks oxygen use. Other injuries may still impair delivery in the same patient. That state has a name, and it is worth learning as a category rather than a label: histotoxic hypoxia. Say it histotoxic hypoxia. Histotoxic means the tissue itself is poisoned. Hypoxia here means the cell is functionally starved of the oxygen step even though oxygen physically arrived, delivery intact, utilization blocked. If you build a mental filing system for hypoxia, this is its own drawer, separate from low-inspired oxygen, separate from anemia, separate from poor perfusion. One consequence of that is worth flagging, because it produces a classic exam finding. If tissues cannot extract and consume oxygen, then blood returning from those tissues has given up less oxygen than usual. Venous oxygen extraction falls. That is the physiologic fingerprint of a utilization problem, and it is the opposite of what you would expect if the tissue were desperately pulling oxygen out of a poorly delivered supply. Set aside one common misconception. Cherry red skin is not required, and the absence of cyanosis does not prove cyanide poisoning. Skin color neither establishes nor excludes the diagnosis. The useful evidence is mechanistic and metabolic. ATP production falls. Now, who feels that first? Not every tissue equally. The organs that run the largest continuous energy bill are the ones that fail earliest, and that is the brain and the heart. Neurons cannot bank energy. They spend constantly on maintaining ion gradients and firing. Cardiac muscle contracts without rest. When mitochondrial ATP output drops sharply, those two go down fast. So the clinical picture is not subtle and not slow. Headache and confusion, progression towards seizure or coma. On the cardiovascular side, hypotension, arrhythmia, and a slide towards circulatory collapse. Breathing often speeds up early. The tempo matters as much as the symptoms a patient failing in brain, breathing, and circulation together within minutes is describing a systemic energy crisis, not one organ becoming diseased. Now the lactate, because this is the finding the question hangs on, and it is worth understanding rather than recognizing, lactate is not a poison the cyanide produced. Nobody poured lactate into the patient. Lactate is a downstream metabolic consequence, and it comes from the cell trying to keep going. Follow the chain. Mitochondrial ATP production collapses, so the cell falls back on glycolysis, which can make a small amount of ATP without oxidative phosphorylation. But glycolysis consumes NAD+, and produces NADH, so it can continue only if NAD+ is regenerated. Under aerobic conditions, cytosolic reducing equivalents are transferred into mitochondria through shuttle systems and ultimately feed the electron transport chain. When the chain is blocked, that route cannot keep up, so the cell uses the fallback. The enzyme lactate dehydrogenase takes pyruvate, the end product of glycolysis, and converts it to lactate. And in doing so, it converts NADH back to NAD+. Name the slots again. Enzyme, lactate dehydrogenase. Substrate, pyruvate. Product, lactate. The point of that reaction is not the lactate. The point is the recycled NAD+ that lets glycolysis keep running for a while longer. Lactate is the exhaust. That explains why oxygen administration alone cannot correct cyanide's mitochondrial block. But be precise. A mask does not prove that tissue oxygen delivery is normal. Hypotension, carbon monoxide, anemia, or poor perfusion can still raise lactate. In this case, the enclosed space fire and rapid multi-system collapse make cyanide plausible, while the named antidote is the decisive mechanism clue. To be precise, a high lactate by itself does not prove cyanide poisoning. Plenty of things raise lactate. Severe lactate in an enclosed space fire with rapid neurologic and cardiovascular failure makes cyanide a serious consideration, but a single number never carries the diagnosis alone. We are ready for the question. Here is the case, and I will read it in pieces so you can build the picture the way you would in a real room. A 46-year-old man is rescued from a fire in a closed furniture warehouse. The important detail is the enclosed space, where combustion products can accumulate. Burning nitrogen-containing materials found in some furnishings can release hydrogen cyanide. That is background risk, not a diagnosis. A question does not have to print the word cyanide to test it, but a fire alone does not prove it either. Next, he is confused and tachypnic. Confusion is the brain. Tachypnea, rapid breathing, is partly the respiratory drive responding to acid, and partly a body that senses something is badly wrong with energy metabolism. Two high-demand systems already showing strain. Next, soot is visible around his mouth. This tells you he inhaled combustion products. It confirms the exposure route. It does not tell you which combustion product is doing the damage. Smoke carries many, including carbon monoxide. Next, his blood pressure is 82/48 millimeters of mercury. That is hypotension. Now, three systems are failing together: brain, breathing, circulation, and they are failing quickly. Hold that pattern against the mechanism we built. A cell-level energy failure does not respect organ boundaries. It shows up wherever the energy bill is highest. Next, and this is the load-bearing line, arterial blood gas testing shows severe lactic acidosis despite administration of high-flow oxygen. There it is. Oxygen is being administered, yet severe lactic acidosis is present. That is compatible with failed mitochondrial oxygen utilization, but it is not specific, especially in a hypotensive fire victim. The clue that settles this mechanism question comes next, the antidote that was chosen. And finally, the emergency team gives intravenous hydroxocobalamin. Say it, hydroxocobalamin. When a STEM tells you what was given, the drug is evidence. The treatment team's choice tells you what they suspected and narrows the mechanism being tested. You do not have to identify the poison from smoke alone. The named antidote points toward it. Now the question, in full, and then all 5 choices read out. A 46-year-old man is rescued from a fire in a closed furniture warehouse. He is confused and tachypneic. Soot is visible around his mouth. His blood pressure is 82/48 millimeters of mercury, and arterial blood gas testing shows severe lactic acidosis despite administration of high-flow oxygen. The emergency team gives intravenous hydroxocobalamin. Which of the following molecular events most directly explains the benefit of this treatment? Choice A. Oxidation of hemoglobin iron from iron 2+ to iron 3+, that is, hemoglobin iron being oxidized from the ferrous to the ferric state. Choice B. Donation of sulfur for conversion of cyanide to thiocyanate. Choice C. Coordination of cyanide by a cobalt center to form cyanocobalamin. Choice D. Reactivation of acetylcholinesterase inhibited by organophosphates. Choice E. Reduction of methemoglobin ion from iron 3+ to iron 2+, ferric back down to ferrous. Read the stem once more if you need it, and listen to the exact wording of the task. Most directly explains the benefit. That phrase is doing work. More than one of these options is a real mechanism belonging to a real cyanide antidote. Some of them would help this patient if you gave the corresponding drug. The question is not asking what helps, it is asking what this drug does at the molecular level in one step. Lock in your answer. The answer is C. Coordination of cyanide by a cobalt center to form cyanocobalamin. Now, let's build why by finally introducing the drug properly. Hydroxocobalamin, what kind of thing is it? It is a cobalt-containing molecule in the vitamin B12 family. Not a protein, not an enzyme. A single small molecule built around a central cobalt atom. And that cobalt sits in the trivalent state, cobalt 3+. What role does it play here? Antidote, and specifically a binder, not a repair enzyme. And who is it related to? Directly to cyanide, the free cyanide circulating in the patient. The event itself, the cobalt center, coordinates the cyanide ion. Cyanide latches onto that cobalt, and the resulting molecule is cyanocobalamin, say it, cyanoCobalamin, which is a form of vitamin B12, relatively non-toxic, and cleared in the urine. The cobalt matters because it provides a high-affinity binding site for cyanide. Hydroxocobalamin therefore acts as a molecular trap. Its trivalent cobalt coordinates cyanide and converts the drug into cyanocobalamin. That direct binding lowers the amount of unbound cyanide available to inhibit complex 4. Follow the consequence in the direction the mechanism runs. Hydroxocobalamin binds available cyanide and forms cyanocobalamin, which is eliminated in urine. As the cyanide burden at cytochrome C oxidase falls, electron transfer to oxygen can recover. Proton pumping, the gradient, and oxidative phosphorylation can then recover as well. That downstream recovery is the benefit. Cobalt binding is the first molecular event. One fine distinction matters. You may see this drug described as preventing cyanide from binding ferric ions in cytochrome C oxidase. That is a true statement about the net effect, but it is one step downstream. The most direct molecular event is cobalt binding cyanide. Protecting complex 4 follows. When a question says most directly, it is asking you to stop at the first event, not the useful outcome. That is a general exam skill, and it shows up in pharmacology constantly. Learn to ask, what does the drug molecule touch first? One boundary note, so this stays exam teaching rather than clinical instruction. I am not giving you doses, thresholds, or a treatment protocol, and this episode is not a management guide. In a real fire victim, carbon monoxide and cyanide exposure can both be present at once, and real management addresses that. What we are extracting here is the molecular event, which is what the question asked for. Now the wrong answers, and this set is unusually well built. 4 of the 5 options are real mechanisms of real drugs. Learning which drug owns which mechanism is worth more than the answer letter, because a question writer can swap the drug in the stem and reuse all 5 options unchanged. Choice A. oxidation of hemoglobin iron from iron 2+ to iron 3+. This is the strongest distractor, and it deserves the most time because it is not a random wrong answer. It is a genuine cyanide antidote mechanism. It belongs to sodium nitrite. Here is what sodium nitrite does. Hemoglobin normally carries iron in the ferrous state, iron 2+, which is the state that binds and carries oxygen. Sodium nitrite oxidizes some of that iron to the ferric state, iron 3+. Hemoglobin with ferric iron is called methemoglobin. Say it, methemoglobin. And methemoglobin cannot carry oxygen. That sounds like sabotage, and in a different context it would be. But ferric iron is exactly what cyanide likes to bind. So you have deliberately created a large pool of ferric iron in the bloodstream that pulls cyanide away from the mitochondria. Option A describes a working strategy against the right poison, but the mechanism belongs to sodium nitrite. Sodium nitrite makes methemoglobin. Hydroxocobalamin does not. If an option says induces methemoglobin formation, connect it to nitrite. Choice B. Donation of sulfur for conversion of cyanide to thiocyanate. Also a real cyanide antidote mechanism, and this one belongs to sodium thiosulfate. The body has its own enzyme for disposing of cyanide. It is called rhodinase, ROH-darnase, a sulfur-transferring enzyme found in mitochondria. Name the slots. Enzyme, rhodinase. Substrate, cyanide. Product, thiocyanate, THYOSYANATE, which is far less toxic and is excreted by the kidney. The limiting piece is the sulfur. Rhodinase needs a sulfur donor to run, and sodium thiosulfate supplies it. So thiosulfate is not attacking cyanide itself. It is refueling an enzyme that does. The detoxification route is real, but sulfur donation belongs to thiosulfate. Hydroxocobalamin does not donate sulfur or require rhodinase. It binds cyanide directly without an enzyme in the middle. Choice D belongs to a different poisoning and to pralidoxime. Organophosphates inhibit acetylcholinesterase, and pralidoxime can reactivate it before the bond ages. This stem contains no cholinergic syndrome, and hydroxocobalamin has no action on that enzyme. Choice E. Reduction of methemoglobin iron from iron 3+ to iron 2+. Read it against option A, and you will see the trick option E runs the same reaction backwards. This is the mechanism associated with methylene blue treatment of acquired methemoglobinemia, restoring ferrous iron so hemoglobin can carry oxygen again. That is a separate toxicology pathway, not the action of hydroxocobalamin. Option E runs in the opposite direction from option A. Sodium nitrite deliberately creates methemoglobin to catch cyanide. Methylene blue helps reduce methemoglobin so hemoglobin can carry oxygen again. Oxidation of ferrous to ferric is nitrite. Reduction of ferric to ferrous is methylene blue. So here is the map to keep. Option A, sodium nitrite. Option B, sodium thiosulfate, working through rhodinase. Option C, hydroxocobalamin, our drug. Option D, pralidoxime for organophosphates. Option E, methylene blue for methemoglobinemia. 5 options, 5 different drugs. The stem named one of them, and that is what settled it. 2 contrasts turn this single item into a reusable framework. Both get tested constantly, and both are answerable from the machinery we built rather than from memory. First contrast, carbon monoxide versus cyanide. Both show up in fire smoke, so questions like to put them in the same room. Carbon monoxide is a delivery problem. It binds hemoglobin in place of oxygen, and it also makes the hemoglobin molecule hold on to whatever oxygen it still carries more tightly, so less oxygen gets released to tissues. Less carried, and what is carried is released less willingly. The mitochondria are fine. The taxi service failed. Cyanide is primarily a utilization problem. Even when oxygen reaches tissue, the mitochondrial machine at the destination cannot complete the final electron transfer. In a real fire victim, delivery may also be impaired by carbon monoxide or shock, so keep the mechanism distinction without pretending the patient has only one problem. And here is the honest boundary. Because exam simplifications can mislead in a real emergency department, an enclosed space fire can produce both exposures in the same patient. This is not a clean either-or in reality. What is clean is the mechanism split, and that is what the question is testing. Second contrast, and this one is a favorite, an electron transport chain inhibitor versus an uncoupler. Cyanide is an inhibitor. It blocks a complex, electron flow slows so oxygen consumption falls, proton pumping falls, the gradient falls, and ATP falls. An uncoupler is a different class of agent. It does not block any complex. It creates a way for hydrogen ions to leak back across the inner mitochondrial membrane without passing through ATP synthase. Now think it through with the machinery rather than recalling it. Protons return freely, so the gradient can never build up. Electron transport is what rebuilds the gradient, and with the gradient constantly draining, the chain runs harder, not slower. So oxygen consumption goes up, but the returning protons bypassed ATP synthase, so ATP still falls, and the energy comes out as heat. Put them side by side. Both drop ATP. That part is the same, and it is why the two get confused. They differ on oxygen consumption, and they differ in opposite directions. Inhibitor, oxygen consumption down. Uncoupler, oxygen consumption up. If a question gives you an oxygen consumption measurement, that number alone separates the two classes. Let's stress test the rule the way an exam writer would. Same patient, same fire, same lactate. I change exactly one thing at a time, and you watch the answer move. Variation 1. The team gives sodium nitrite instead of hydroxocobalamin. Now the correct mechanism is oxidation of hemoglobin ion from iron 2+ to iron 3+, forming methemoglobin that binds cyanide. Option A becomes the answer, and the cobalt option becomes the distractor. Nothing about the patient changed. The drug changed. Variation 2. The team gives sodium thiosulfate. Now the answer is sulfur donation, letting Rhodanese convert cyanide to thiocyanate. Option B. Variation 3. Same case, but the question asks instead, which structure does the toxin directly inhibit? Now no antidote is involved at all, and the answer is cytochrome C oxidase, complex 4, in the inner mitochondrial membrane. Variation 4. The question asks why the lactate is elevated. The answer is not because cyanide makes lactate. It is that oxidative phosphorylation failed, so the cell shifted to anaerobic glycolysis and converted pyruvate to lactate to regenerate NAD+. Same case, different link in the same chain. Variation 5. The stem swaps cyanide for an uncoupling agent and reports the patient's oxygen consumption. Now oxygen consumption should be increased rather than decreased, and body temperature can rise. If you answered by memorizing poison, therefore oxygen consumption down, you just got it wrong. If you answered from the machinery, you got it right. These one-variable changes show whether the mechanism transfers beyond the original case. One line to carry out of here, and it is the line to write on a card. Cyanide blocks complex 4. Hydroxocobalamin binds cyanide with cobalt. Unpack it whenever you need the rest. Complex 4 means cytochrome C oxidase in the inner mitochondrial membrane, with the heme A3 copper B center where oxygen accepts the final electrons. Blocking it creates histotoxic hypoxia. Cellular oxygen use falls, ATP falls, high-demand organs fail, and lactate rises as glycolysis regenerates NAD+ through lactate formation. Binding with cobalt means one hydroxocobalamin molecule capturing one cyanide ion to form cyanocobalamin, which is eliminated in urine. And carry the reasoning move separately, because it will earn you points in questions that have nothing to do with toxicology. When a STEM tells you what was given, treat the drug as evidence about the diagnosis. When a question asks for the most direct molecular event, stop at what the drug molecule itself does, and do not drift downstream to the outcome you like better. And when several options are all true mechanisms, the deciding question is never, is this real? It is, whose mechanism is this? Next time a fire victim presents with severe lactate and a cyanide antidote in the stem, walk the chain. Delivery or utilization, which complex, which metal center, and what the named drug touches first.